I don't know how to tell it. I think I need to share it. I work at a local attraction, a haunted corn maze, and honestly, there's nothing more exhausting than spending hours at night scaring people after having to deal with preparations and makeup. I always get home very late, around midnight, and I always feel a little weird, you know? The makeup stuck to his face, his body tired. The only thing that excites me when I return home is knowing that I can collapse in bed after taking everything off. But that night, something was strange, something I'll never be able to explain. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was finally washing my face in the bathroom. The room was dark and silent, only the sound of water and my heavy breathing filling the space. My sister was in our room, already lying down and, as always, sleeping peacefully. It gave me a strange feeling, a tranquility that almost made me relax. But it didn't last long. As I was finishing rinsing my face, I heard a noise coming from the living room. It was a soft but clear sound, as if something had been touched or moved. I immediately thought it was my younger brother. He is 10 years old and has the habit of getting up at dawn to look for something to do, to pick up a book or a toy. I was so tired that I accidentally started mumbling to myself, imagining that he was trying to be stealthy, but I didn't want that to stop him from going to bed soon. "John, go to sleep, boy," I said loudly without much spirit, waiting for him to hear me from the living room. The answer I got, however, was not what I expected. It wasn't a response from a boy trying to do something hidden, nor an apology for being up so late. It was a laugh, a low, muffled laugh, but so sharp it chilled my spine. This baffled me, but not enough to act urgently. "John," I called, a little firmer, but there was no other word, just that laugh. I went to the living room already irritated, and what I saw made me question my sanity. When I entered the room, the atmosphere was darker than usual. The light from the lamp barely illuminated the space, and everything seemed a little more stuffy, as if the air was heavier. I went to the living room and looked around, but I didn't see anything. The initial noise I had heard disappeared, but the sound of laughter still echoed in my head. I looked around, trying to process what was happening. Then, in the corner of the room near the bookshelf, I saw a wooden chair that always stayed there. Something moved behind her, something fast like a shadow that crept to the other side. I stood still for a moment, not knowing what to do. What could it be? I was already so tired. I had already spent all day working, and it all seemed like a bad joke. But the feeling was strange, as if the environment around me had changed. That didn't make sense. Frustrated, I went towards the chair. The last thing I wanted was to have to deal with something strange in the middle of the night, but it was bothering me too much. Anger motivated me more than fear. I crouched behind the chair, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to find some logical explanation. But when I looked the other way, there was nothing. No shadow, no sound. Only the room was empty, and the feeling that I was tired. I decided that if anyone was hiding, they must be having fun at the expense of my confusion. I went to my brother's room to see if he was in bed. When I entered, I found John lying on his side with the cover pulled up to his head, breathing calmly. He was completely still, without the slightest indication that he had gotten up. There was nothing there to suggest that he was involved in any prank. And suddenly, a new sensation began to invade me. Something wasn't right. I stood there, watching, John trying to understand what was happening. The idea that he could have gotten up and returned so quickly to bed seemed absurd. That didn't make sense. The silence was becoming unbearable. I could feel my breathing quicker, and for a moment I found myself holding my breath, trying to hear something that told me that it all had a simple explanation. But nothing came. No sound, no laughter. Only the weight of silence, which somehow seemed to suffocate me. I returned to the living room, still with the feeling that there was something very wrong there. I tried to ignore the strangeness and focus on what could have caused that noise. Maybe a window that was barely closed, maybe some noise from the old house. But as my eyes scanned the room, something made me stop again. The air was dry, heavy, as if the walls were closer. I've never felt that before, as if there was something that wouldn't let me leave that room, a feeling of urgency, that something was about to happen. I went to the window and opened it just to breathe some fresh air. The wind was cold and biting, but it didn't help calm my nervousness. When I looked down, I noticed something that left me even more disconcerted. The shadows on the street were moving strangely, as if they were writhing, distorted by the streetlight. I never realized it before, but that night it seemed all wrong. It was as if the shadows had a life of their own. It was then that, for the first time, I felt fear taking over me relentlessly. The fear of being alone, of not being able to understand what was happening, of not having control over it. That noise I had heard before, the laughter, the chair moving by itself, the shadows, none of this made sense, but it seemed like everything was connected. I was no longer just trying to deal with a simple late-night scare. Something was happening there in that house, and I didn't know what. The worst thing is that the more I tried to rationalize, the more I realized that the logical explanation simply didn't exist. I was being enveloped by something much bigger than myself. I decided to take one last look at the house. I needed to find an explanation, anything that would make me feel safer. I walked back to the hallway where everything was silent. However, something caught my attention. The bedroom doors were slightly ajar, which was not normal. I always made sure all the doors were securely closed before bed. I walked to my sister's room and, when I looked inside, I saw her bed empty. She wasn't there, which made me even more agitated. That didn't make any sense. She should have been there sleeping unless she had gone to the bathroom. My heart raced. The fear that was already present now seemed to take over me, like a force that made me move without thinking. I looked around, trying to find some clue, anything that would make me understand what was happening. But it was when I turned to the end of the hallway to the room where John was that I saw it. There was a shadow on the wall, reflected strangely by the faint light coming in from the window. It moved, stretched, seemed to grow by the second. I didn't know what else to do. With an impulse, I ran to my brother's room again. I opened the door quickly, and before I could understand what I was seeing, the streetlight briefly illuminated the wall of the room. The shadow disappeared in the blink of an eye, but something else caught my attention. There were marks on the ground, as if something had been dragged there, and they led to the window. The window was open, and I felt the icy wind coming in through it. But what made me completely terrified was the fact that I was sure that the window was closed when I entered the room. The feeling that something or someone had been there was unbearable. I stepped away from the window, and as I looked across the room, I saw what looked like a silhouette, but it dissipated before I had time to scream. Something was there. Something was watching us, and it wasn't John. She wasn't my sister, I knew that. I don't know how to explain it, but whatever it was chasing me, and I didn't know why. Panic began to wash over me in a way I had never experienced. I knew I needed to do something, but the feeling that I was completely out of control only increased. The fear came not only from what I couldn't understand, but from the feeling of being watched. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find my sister, see if she was okay. If she had left the room, if she had gone to the bathroom or the living room, at least I would have an explanation for all this. But no matter how hard I searched, I could find no sign of her. I ran into the room again, hoping that maybe she was there, but what I saw made me stop halfway. The room was exactly as I had left it before. The chair was still in its place. The light from the lamp illuminated the same part of the wall. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't touch, as if the environment was weighing on me. My body was tense, as if an invisible presence was pressing down on me, and for a second the room seemed to grow, expand, creating a sense of suffocation. I needed to breathe, but fear blocked me. That's when I heard it again, the laughter. But now she didn't come from the room. It didn't come from anywhere inside the house. She seemed to be outside, but it didn't make sense. I could feel that something was there. The laughter was followed by a whisper. I couldn't understand the words, but the way the sound dragged as if it was creeping through the house was enough to make me panic. Something was moving inside the walls. I could feel it. I had no more time. I ran to my sister's room once again, almost not knowing why. When I entered, I saw that her bed was the same way, but this time there was something different in the room. I couldn't see clearly, but something in the corner near the bed was moving, like a slowly creeping shadow. Before I could get closer, whatever it was, it disappeared, and for a moment I thought I was going to lose my reason right there. I needed to find my sister, pick up my brother, and leave that house. I was on the verge of a breakdown. Each step I took seemed to take me deeper into something I couldn't understand, and the more I searched, the harder it became to distinguish reality from what I was imagining. I then decided to call my sister. It was clear that she was not home, but perhaps at least that would give me some relief. The cell phone rang for a few seconds. That's when I saw that he was under her pillow. I stood there looking at him, lost in my thoughts. That's when I heard a sound, the sound of footsteps, and then a laugh. The same laugh I had heard earlier. But it was not only that. There was something else, something that made my stomach turn. It was as if the air itself had become heavier, as if the environment around me was distorting. "Sophia, where are you? What's going on?" I asked again now, almost desperate. But instead of an answer, there was a long silence. Whatever was going on there, it was no longer something I could ignore. I needed to go after her, but I didn't know where to start. Suddenly, the lights in the house began to flicker, first once, then twice, until they began to blink erratically, as if an invisible force was playing with electricity. The house seemed to be moving, as if the structure was alive, feeling the presence of something I couldn't see. Fear consumed me, but at the same time, something inside me pushed me to action. I needed to find my sister. I needed to do something before the worst happened. But whatever was there with me, it no longer seemed to be a mere coincidence. It was as if the house itself was against me. I went to the kitchen, and as I passed through the hallway, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. Darkness seemed to take over everything. Suddenly, an icy hand touched the back of my neck, and I almost jumped forward, with a scream stuck in my throat. When I turned around, I saw nothing, but the feeling that something was there, behind me, was overwhelming. The house, which had once seemed familiar to me, was now unrecognizable, as if everything had been turned upside down. I wasn't alone with my brother. Something was with me, and it was watching me, waiting for me. I felt the pressure in my chest increase by the second. The silence of the house was interrupted by a crack, and soon the sound of something dragging across the floor. I looked at the floor, but there was nothing there. Just the echo of my own footsteps, mixed with that strange noise. My body was stiff, and I had the feeling that if I moved too fast, what watched me in the darkness would catch me. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen, as if fear itself was pinning me to the ground. Then once again the laughter. Now I could hear her clearly, coming from one of the rooms. That laughter was sickening, unbearable. I could no longer ignore what was happening. The laughter echoed in my mind as if it was being projected directly inside me, and I knew I couldn't stand still. With a superhuman effort, I managed to move towards my sister's room, where the laughter seemed to be stronger. Every step I took was as if I were walking against a current, the heavy, dense air pushing me back. When I finally reached the door of the room, I felt a biting cold, as if winter had invaded that small and dark space. My sister's bed was empty as before, but now there was something different. The covers were untidy, as if someone had gotten up in a hurry, and in the center of the bed there was a dark stain. I moved closer, hesitantly, and realized that it was a thick, dark, almost black liquid that slowly ran down the mattress and dripped onto the floor. The smell was metallic, sweet, and disgusting at the same time. My stomach churned, and I had to hold onto the wall so I wouldn't fall. What was that? It was then that I heard a whisper, low and hoarse, coming from the darkest corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was strange, distorted, as if coming from far away, but at the same time it was there, inside the room. I looked into the corner, but there was nothing but shadows. The shadows, however, seemed to move, to writhe, as if they were alive. I felt a presence there, something that was not human, something that was watching me, studying me. Fear paralyzed me, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to find my sister. I decided to leave the room, but when I turned around, the door was closed. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was as if something was holding on to the other side. I knocked on the door, screaming for help, but I only heard the laughter again, now louder, closer. The light in the room began to flicker, and in the brief pauses of darkness, I could see shapes moving around me, shadows that stretched and twisted as if they were trying to reach me. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but when I opened them, the scene in front of me changed completely. I was no longer in my sister's room. It was in a dark, narrow corridor with walls of old, cracked wood. The floor was made of beaten earth, and the air was loaded with the smell of mold and something else, something rotten. I didn't recognize this place, but it felt familiar, as if I had come out of a nightmare I had had before. At the end of the corridor, there was a door, ajar, and a dim, flickering light was leaking through it. I knew I shouldn't go there, but something pulled me, as if I had no choice. I walked to the door, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. When I got there, I pushed the door slowly, and what I saw brought me to my knees. It was a small, dirty room with walls covered with strange symbols and dark spots. In the center of the room there was a figure sitting in a chair, with his back to me. I knew who she was even before she turned around. It was my sister, Sophia. But she was not well. She was wearing my costume and the same makeup I do at work, yet her face was pale and distorted, as if it had been stretched and twisted, and her eyes were completely black, blank, lifeless. She smiled at me, a wide, unnatural grin, and then started laughing. The same laugh I had heard before, but now it was louder, more insane. "Are you afraid?" she repeated, and her voice was a mixture of tones as if several people were talking at once. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was stuck there, staring at that twisted version of my sister, as her laughter filled the air and the shadows around me came closer. I closed my eyes, trying to block everything out, but when I opened them again, I was back in my sister's room, in bed, with the morning sun streaming in through the window. I was sweaty, panting, and my heart was beating so hard I thought I was going to explode. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened. The room was normal, the bed made, no dark spots, no shadows moving. And then I saw my sister, sleeping peacefully in her bed, as if nothing had happened. I shook her, trying to wake her. Up, and she opened her eyes, confused. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" she asked in a sleepy, normal voice, completely different from the distorted voice I had heard. I didn't know what to say. How could he explain what had happened? How could I tell her that I had experienced something so real, so terrifying, and that now everything seemed normal? I didn't say anything. I just hugged her, crying silently as she comforted me, not understanding what was happening. I knew there was no point in trying to explain. No one would believe me, neither she nor my brother. They hadn't lived through that. They hadn't seen what I had seen. For them, it was just another normal night. But for me, that night changed everything. Over time, I tried to forget what had happened. I tried to convince myself that it had been a nightmare, a hallucination, caused by stress and fatigue. My sister believed that. She said that I had had a stress crisis, that since the tragic death of our parents, I had felt responsible for taking care of her and our younger brother, and that it had affected me more than I imagined, and that working in that labyrinth scaring people contributed to the increase of these sensations. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was all just a product of my tired and overloaded mind. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew something had happened that night, something I couldn't explain. The shadows, the laughter, the dark room, the distorted version of my sister. All of this was etched in my memory, as vivid and real as anything else I had ever experienced. And as much as I tried to forget, as much as I tried to move on, that night never left me. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, or when I'm at work, I still hear the laughter. I still feel the presence of the shadows, moving around me, watching me. And I know that no matter how hard I try, I will never be able to forget what I experienced. I will never be able to erase that night from my mind, because I know that was real. And I know that one day, it will come back. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.